Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Propeller Club of Northern California. I'm Stas Margaronis, and today our featured speaker is Bruce Jones, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, who's going to be discussing his book, To Rule the Waves. And Bruce has been to China on a number of occasions. He has a lot to say in his book. He also has a number of observations from his discussions with Maersk Lines and with OOCL. And he's also been to the Yangshan megaport, which is a role model for port development around the world. It is the most, I think it, Bruce, I'm not sure, is it the largest port in the world? Yeah. So we are very interested in hearing from Bruce about his observations, especially his issues of trade and supply chain issues continue to confound us. So Bruce has a hard stop at 12, so I want to get us started promptly. And as you all know, I like to introduce everybody so everybody knows who everybody is. And I will start with my friend and colleague, Todd Crawshaw. Todd, good morning.
Good morning. It's Todd Crawshaw. Company is Crawshaw Design. We provide website support and IT support.
Thank you. Todd, would you make sure everybody is muted because I'm hearing a little bit of noise in the background there.
All right.
Dennis Dysinger. Good morning, Dennis. How are you?
Hey, Stas, doing well. This is Dennis at Mare Island Dry Dock here in Vallejo.
Very good. Thank you for being here. Hold on a second. I'm getting, I'm losing, for some reason, I've got my, hold on. Okay. Doug Thiessen. Good morning, Doug.
Good morning, everybody.
Doug, you want to introduce yourself? Say who you are?
Yeah, sure. My name is Doug Thiessen, and I work for HDR Engineering Company. It is a large national, international firm, and I'm based in Long Beach, California, and I'm a former employee of the Port of Long Beach and the Port of Los Angeles. So I'm down here in Southern California, and really excited to hear about the presentation today.
Thank you very much. Peter Dreyfus. Good morning, Peter.
Good day, Commodore. Peter Dreyfus here. I'm a co-founder and manufacturer of Watermaster North America, and we are fabricating a 40-foot dredge in Michigan, which is for the shorelines and the shallow waters of the world. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Peter. Conte Sikala, good morning.
Morning, everyone. How you doing?
Good. You just want to tell us who you are?
Sure. So I'm a maritime lawyer with Clyde & Co. And I also went to the same high school as Alfred T. Mahan, which whose name may come up in this.
Okay. Very good. Bruce Jones. Good morning, Bruce. Bruce, are you there?
Want me to do me? I think you just did me. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings
Bruce. You know,
Institution.
I'm asleep at the wheel. You're already in there. Okay, we know who you are. Darren Shins. Darren, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. I'm one of the senior route analysts for Storm Geo Shipping Division. I'm out here in Santa Clara. Also the internal audit manager.
Very good. Glad to have you and glad to have your team from Storm Geo, Darren. Thank you very much for being here. Greg Greenway. Greg, good morning.
Good morning, all. I'm Greg Greenway. I'm the executive director of the Seaport Industrial Association in Redwood City. We're a group of industrial companies at and around the port, and so I work closely with Christine at the Port of Redwood City.
We're very pleased to have you, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you.
And my good friend, John Byrne. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, everyone. Jahan Byrne with Maritime Logistics.
I see somebody named Jason without a last name. Can they introduce themselves?
Hey, how you doing? My name is Jason Hong. I'm also with Storm Geo. I'm a fleet information technician and also a part of the audit team. Really happy to be here and excited to see what type of information I can glean from this. Thank you for the invite.
Jason, welcome, and we're very pleased to have you. And again, thank you, and thanks to Storm Geo for your support of the Propeller Club.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And my good friend from down in Texas way, John Hart. Good morning, John.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me as a guest today. I am a member of the Houston chapter here in the Propeller Club. I'm an adjunct professor at Texas A&M at the Maritime Academy in Galveston, where I'm also a graduate of and been teaching there for 20 years, and also work for the FH Bertling Group, which is a German-based ship owner and logistics company. And I'm working with the executive board for IPC on the webinar development for this year.
Very good. John, thank you very much for being here and for all of your input. Kim Arave. Kim, good morning. Kim, you've got to unmute yourself.
Kim Araby, retired Pacific Maritime Association Director of Training. I'm a Master Mariner and a Captain retired USN.
Thank you very much, Kim. And how are we doing on our favorite Victory ship?
The Red Oak Victory. They're doing wonderful. They've had a reduced docents and reduced attendees to tour the ship, but boy, it sure is a great museum ship, and it helped us win the Second World War.
Well, Kim, I've promised, and I need to come back to you. We need to do a feature to talk about the good work that you guys have done restoring the Red Oak Victory. And if you would send me an email just prompting me, I will get something going, and at least maybe we could have a conversation at our next executive board.
Roger that.
Thank you very much. Maura Freermuth, good morning.
Good morning. I am a student at the California Maritime Academy. I am the representative from the Cal Maritime chapter of the Propeller Club. I'm a global studies and maritime affairs major, and I am here to absorb information and report back to my associates.
Maura, you're very welcome, and thank you for being here. And I hope we'll have more participants from the Cal Maritime Propeller Club.
Yes, we mistakenly scheduled our meeting for the same time as this meeting today, so I am missing that to be here today.
Well,
this is far more interesting.
Well, I appreciate that, and if you'll remember, February 8th, we're going to have Lars Jensen from Vespucci Consulting doing a global container trade report, and that might be interesting for your colleagues.
Right, I'll write that down. Thank you.
Okay, I have Pete Rossi here. Pete, good morning.
Good morning. I'm a claims analyst with Storm Geo.
Very good. Thank you very much. And my good friend and board of directors member, Susan Ransom. Susan, good morning.
Good morning, everybody. Susan Ransom, Client Relations Manager for SSA. We are the largest stevedoring terminal in the Port of Oakland. Stas, if you don't mind, I have a couple of really quick announcements to make.
Please.
The integrated feasibility report and environmental assessment report is out with regards to the turning basin. Interested parties, hopefully on this call, have until January 31st to submit comments. As you know, the turning basin is hugely important to port business. So we hope that everybody can call in. Secondly, tomorrow on January 19th at 3 o'clock, The Oakland Planning Commission will meet to vote on whether to recommend that the City Council certify the Howard Terminal FEIR. It's critical to get public comment on any concerns regarding that certification. Hopefully Todd can maybe list both the links for those so everybody can participate. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the session today.
Susan, thank you very much. Todd, would you put the link in the chat? We have the one for the turning basin. I do not have the Howard Terminal Planning Commission, but I will send that out to everybody after the meeting, and you can see the turning basin link. The turning basin needs to be widened so that we can have bigger ships able to maneuver in the Oakland estuary. It is a critical part of the future of the port and of the port infrastructure. And Susan at SSA is the lead person on this. We need to get this process through. There are some issues with land that pertains to the possible Howard Terminal ballpark, and we want to get the public comments to the Army Corps. So if you have anything to say in favor, and I hope you will be in favor because it's vital for all of our futures, please click on that link and send your comment in before January 31st. And as I said, I will get the message out about the meeting, which is tomorrow, the Planning Commission meeting, which is also important in terms of feedback about the environmental impact report on Howard Terminal. Now, Tony Petronio, did I introduce you? I don't think I did.
No, you did not. Good morning, Stas. Good morning, everybody. Tony Petronio. I'm one of the general managers at Storm Geo, and looking forward to today's topic for sure.
Thank you very much. And I see my good friend and old friend, Mr. Bill Nixon. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Sorry for being late. I just got released from the security meeting. You know, I'm excited today on this. As soon as I heard the program today, I ordered the audio book. And I just yesterday listened. I listened to audiobooks on my daily walk around the neighborhood. And this sounds really exciting and very in keeping with all the hot topic in our industry today right now. And it's also exciting to be able to actually listen to a guy on a Zoom meeting that is the author of a book that I'm now quite interested even in the first few pages of reading. So thank you, Stas, for bringing this guy to us.
Bill, you're very welcome. Bill Nixon is probably the best read person on the West Coast waterfront and is a valuable source of all sorts of maritime information and a principal at Transmarine Navigation. Bill, thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
And last but not least, I am honored this morning to have Christine Zortman, Executive Director of the Port of Redwood City, with us, a member of the Propeller Club and a longtime supporter of ours. Christine, good morning. Now, I see her, but I do not hear her. Christine?
Good morning. Good morning, Stas. Thank you. I apologize. I'm having some technical difficulties here this morning, but thank you. I'm really forward to the presentation. Good to see you.
And how is our plan to get annual dredging to the port going?
That is a great question. Actually, recently the district just completed a financial assessment with the conclusion that annual dredging would be the most economical for our channel. And so we're working with them to try and get that advanced as soon as possible, including possibly even this season.
Okay. Christine, if you could get me some background on that, I will see if I can maybe get us some attention in our local media.
Absolutely, would appreciate that.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think, Todd, have I gotten everybody?
I think so. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, if anybody, if I have not introduced anybody, would you raise your hand so I make sure I get everybody? All right, well, seeing none, I am going to introduce our speaker, who is Bruce Jones, who's the senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, who has written a very timely book called To Rule the Waves, which I'm showing. It doesn't show very well because I've got my background here, but you can sort of see it. And I will, it's on our website, obviously. I talked to Bruce about having him speak to us as soon as I read the book, which is fascinating, and talks about a major problem that we have with China, which is that while China has been investing in its infrastructure and in its maritime assets, the United States has not. And the gap has grown worse. And we are really a product of a failure over 40 years to really take a lot of our maritime infrastructure seriously. And the supply chain crisis that we are faced with is in part an infrastructure crisis. It is the reason why we have inflation. You look at some of the challenges that we've had over the last 2 years with on-dock rail, with roads and bridges, with our trucking, with the shortage of chassis and containers, the dislocations that have been caused by empty containers jamming up, the inability to get loaded containers off, and the challenges that you've all heard about from our agricultural exporters about not being able to get space on ocean carriers going to Asia and Europe, the fact that we are no longer a player on the maritime front and that we are a minor figure, except of course our friends from Natsen who are running a service to Hawaii and China. They're one of the few people out there that are still active on the Pacific front for us, but we are a very, very small minority. Our shipbuilding is not competitive with the world. We have serious issues about the lack of investment in ancillary issues, including inland ports, which is a major potential growth area for the future. All of these issues, containers, chassis, container cranes. You heard our presentation last year from ZPMC and the huge amount of work that they have done revolutionizing the quality of ports in China and then going abroad. I was saying to Bruce when we got started that when I first went to China in 1983, everybody's on bicycles and they are not anymore. So without further ado, I want to introduce Bruce Jones, a fellow at the Brookings Institute and the author of To Rule the Waves, How Control of the World's Oceans Shapes the Fate of the Superpowers. Bruce, good morning, welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Well, Stas, thank you for having me, and thank you all for joining. I wish I was with you in person, especially given your location, which is preferable to my location and in Washington, D.C., but I'm excited to have the conversation. One of the things that my father taught me growing up is he said, you never try to sell coals to Manchester. The academic version of that is don't try to give a talk to people who know more about the issue than you do, which is clearly what I'm about to do, since you guys are sort of hugely expert in maritime trade. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on maritime trade. What I want to do is talk a little bit about how I see both globalization and geopolitics through the lens of maritime developments, and perhaps try to dramatize the importance of what you all do in economic terms, to situate in historical terms the return of China to maritime prowess, and then draw in the world I live in, the national security world, and the way sea-based trade has changed, I think, in a profound and a very dangerous way Chinese and American perceptions, each of the other, and launched us into what can only be described as a naval arms race, which is the backdrop to a lot of the work that I do. The book, and I'll use a presentation. It's not a PowerPoint, but they're just some images that we can use along the way to make it more interesting than just looking at my mod during the whole of a Zoom talk. The book revolves around a trip that I took, in narrative terms, revolves around a trip that I took on the Madrid Maersk, which at the time was the largest container ship in the world, 20,526 TEU. I sailed from Tanjung Pelepas on the Malaysian side of the Singapore port, up through the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the East China Sea, and into Yangshan port in Shanghai. As Stas mentions, the largest port in the world. One of the things I try to dramatize is it's not just the largest port in the world, it's 6 times larger than its nearest competitor, right? So in the last year that I was looking at the statistics, in 2020, LA Long Beach did something in the order of between 8 and 9 million container drops. Yangshan Port in Shanghai did 42 million container drops the same year. And the next 5 largest ports in the world are all Chinese. Just dramatizes, I think, the scale that China plays in commercial trade. Analytically, what the book does is it revolves around the consequence of China's return as a maritime power for the first time in 500 years. What I'll do is I'll go super quickly through the history. I'll just take 1 minute on the history and maybe a couple minutes on the trade history, and then bring in the strategic piece of the puzzle. And then we can take the conversation in any direction that we want to go. The brief points on history are 2. The first is that in the modern period, basically over the last 5 centuries, the state, the nation, the empire that has dominated world politics is that entity which was able to field the world's dominant navy. It was true of the Portuguese when they found the sea route into Asia in the 1500s, of the Dutch, of the French, of the Spanish, most consequentially then of the British for a little bit more than 200 years, leading into the Second World War, at which point we emerge as the world's dominant navy. The second point which is worth making is that the very long period of European, and then we would say Western to incorporate us, of Western dominance of world politics starts as Portugal makes its way into the Indian Ocean. And it's an important historical accident that coincides with China's withdrawal from the high seas. China was, without question, the most sophisticated maritime power in the world in the second half of the 1400s. Just as one illustration, the largest ship in the Chinese fleet was roughly 6 times larger than the largest ship that the Portuguese could deploy at the time. China engaged in extraordinarily sophisticated maritime diplomacy and maritime engineering. Ben Franklin, when he was Postmaster General, wrote about how sophisticated the Chinese fleet design was already back in the 1450s. But in the late 1400s, they choose to withdraw from the seas. They pull the fleet off the oceans and they withdraw from the high seas. And Europe enters the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific at this time when Chinese power is not present, and it sets the stage for European dominance of global politics for the ensuing 5 centuries, and then of course of ours. I'll skip over the history. I'll skip over little details like World War II and the role of naval power in World War II, but we end the Second World War with the United States as the world's dominant navy and having inherited the position previously occupied by the Royal Navy. During the Cold War, I argue in the book, the naval power receded a little bit in terms of kind of the front and center dynamic of geopolitics because of this very unusual experience of having American land power in Europe and in Asia, which changed the dynamics of great power rivalry. Nuclear weapons, air power were more consequential. But in a different part of the world, in a different sphere of the world, the oceans were about to become vastly consequential, which is the world that you all know very well. And I'll go to just some photographs that illustrate some of what I'm talking about in the book. By the way, that's just a photograph from Yangshan Port. It doesn't do a great job of conveying the scale. It's just a vast complex built on reclaimed land off the coast of what was at the time the world's largest sea bridge. Of course, China's now built one that's even larger to go out to Yangshan Port and the 4 bays.
Bruce, we're not seeing your screen share.
Sorry?
We're not seeing your screen share.
You're not seeing it?
No.
All right, sorry, give me 30 seconds here.
There you go.
We see it now?
Yeah, we see it now.
Sorry about that. You would think after this amount of time in Zoom world, I would have been better, but anyway, there we go. Going out to Yangshan Port, talking about the way in which the oceans were about to play a huge role in world affairs. I went back and I looked at global trade in the post-war period. You go to the 1950s, and this is just one facet of trade, but it's illustrative of the overall patterns. Global trade was essentially a flow of raw materials from Latin America into the United States and from Africa into Europe. There's very little trade between those centers, a little bit, but not a great deal. It's essentially a flow of raw materials and agricultural products into the 2 major industrial centers of the world, the United States and Europe, very little between them. Fast forward to present day, and that's global trade. Every major center of the world and every continent, every country in the world connected by this overwhelming network of trade ties. What that's reflecting is this huge increase in the value of trade as a share of global GDP, which is driven, I talk about this in the book at substantial length, which is driven by the revolution in bulk shipping, which starts in the United States in the 50s, slowly works its way through commercial production and port design in the United States and in Europe in the 50s and the 60s, gets a huge boost from the Suez Crisis, from the Vietnam War and the Korean War, then the Vietnam War in the late 60s, early 70s, and then really sets the stage for what happens in the 80s and the 90s, and there's just huge expansion in global trade. This is every ship on the high seas on the day I published my book, just to illustrate the kind of vast expanse in global shipping. I don't need to belabor this stuff. I spent a lot of time on these points with other audiences, but you all know this. You know how consequential sea-based trade is to our economy. 85% of all trade in the world now moves by sea. This graphic, which shows all the networks in the world, gives you a sense of every part of the world being connected. This is a chart that shows trade by value, which really highlights the trade between the major industrial centers of the world, the United States, Europe, and then of course, the eastern seaboard of Asia. This is me on board the Madrid Maersk. I use this with audiences who don't know about container shipping just to give them a little bit of a sense of the scale of these damn things. Giant behemoths of boats in the strategic community. I always highlight that we tend to think about aircraft carriers as big ships. You could take the largest aircraft carrier in the world is the USS Nimitz. You could take 2 of those and drop them into the area displaced by the Madrid Maersk and still have room left over for the Empire State Building. These are very, very, very large ships, as you all know very well. And that huge increase in the scale of global shipping leads to this just dramatic decline in trade costs over the period of the last 70 years. Why do I talk about all this? To go back to Yangshan, because of course it is sea-based trade that ultimately enables the rise of China, as well as some of the other countries that had stayed outside of globalization during the Cold War. And what I do in the book is just chart this as we watch the kind of expansion of trade between the United States and Europe, and then bringing in Japan and Singapore, eventually Hong Kong. I spent a lot of time in the book with C.H. Tung and his family in Hong Kong, and then the rise of OOCL as a major shipping firm in Asia. And the early emergence of Hong Kong as a container port becomes the 2nd largest port in the world by the 1980s. And then, of course, very consequentially, returns to Chinese sovereignty. And that huge race, that huge decline in costs of transportation is really the critical factor in enabling China to begin to participate in globalization. in the 1990s and the 2000s. And what you watch then is just this inexorable rise in the scale of Chinese participation in global trade, signified by the scale of ports. And I already touched on just the huge growth in Chinese ports. So you go back to the 1980s and 1990s, all the largest ports in the world are in the West. And you fast forward to present day, and as I said, you have ports like Yangshan that are 6 times larger than its nearest American competitors. The top ports of the world, all dominated by the Chinese. Now, there are a whole host of implications for that. Stas in his introduction talked on some of them. This is a period of time when we are essentially falling out of the shipbuilding business. We are disinvesting in port infrastructure. We are moving up the value scale in terms of the financing of trade. And I highlight in the book how consequential it is that the United States emerges essentially the banker to world trade, the financier to world trade. But we are not the infrastructure of world trade. China really takes over as the infrastructure of world trade. This has a very important strategic consequence because it begins to drive a deep change in Chinese strategic thinking. We go from a world in which China is unplugged from globalization for the most part in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s to one in which it's hugely plugged into globalization. And it begins to change China's conception of its own security. I spent a lot of time in this book. I'll do this in 30 seconds. We go from a world in which China's core strategic concept is what it calls deep inland defense. The idea that it could, if invaded, as it had been several times through its history, including by us. Americans always forget that we were an early invader of the Chinese in the 1850s and the 1860s. If they are invaded once again, and as they had been throughout their history, they can sort of draw an invader deep inland and cause them to exhaust their resources as they fight the Chinese deep inland. That strategic concept holds for a couple of decades, changes to a notion of what they call, as they become a little bit more confident in the 70s and the 80s after the Cultural Revolution, changes to a notion of coastal defense, the idea that they could actually block an invading army at the coast. And then changes again deeply in the 1990s and the 2000s as they begin to recognize how fundamentally their economy is dependent on the flow of industrial goods and raw materials and energy goods into their ports through the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and then of course the export again of finished products out through those ports as well. And all the major Chinese industrial centers are linked then to ports outside of Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, and about 70% of their economy at that stage is linked to global trade. On the one hand, there's a debate in China that says, in effect, well, look, we can essentially free ride in the US Navy. It's the US Navy that controls these waterways and plays the global role of securing trade, and we can just free ride on that. And in the other hand, there's a kind of an argument inside the Chinese strategic community that says, well, hold on a second, but we're so dependent on the US Navy. What if they want to blockade us? And of course, we have mounted blockades in our history, including of Japan, or an attempt to blockade the Japanese import of oil and rubber during the Second World War is a pretty important part of the War in the Pacific. And this sense of dependence and insecurity begins to take hold in China. And it turns into a major investment in what they call near seas defense. I'm going to go back to share screen for a second and look at some maps. They begin to get very preoccupied about their capacity to defend their own interests inside the waterways that approach China's key ports. Obviously, we're talking about the Western Pacific, but even more, we're talking about the East China Sea and the South China Sea. And they're very preoccupied about building out their naval capacity to defend their interests in those waters. At the same time, they also begin to participate in international counterterrorism efforts in the Malacca Strait and in the Indian Ocean. But what happens then, I think I sort of write it in the book as a kind of tragic story. What happens then is that both China and the United States begin to fundamentally change their perceptions of each other, driven in large part by this change in the naval dynamics. In the book, what I do is I illustrate, I go back to a different point in history, the early 1900s, when Britain is the world's dominant maritime power, both naval and commercial, and Germany is beginning to build up its commercial and its naval infrastructure. And the British decide they need to kind of get a deeper handle on what is happening inside Germany. And it's a British diplomat, Sir Eric Crowe, who's asked to write this memorandum to examine German developments. And he says, look, Germany is becoming a much larger commercial power. They understand that the central purpose of naval power is to protect maritime commerce. And so they're investing in their naval power. They say that it's purely defensive, and they're probably right. They probably mean it. But what if they change their mind? We can't take that risk. And he concludes the famous Crowe memorandum by saying this is a risk that Britain cannot safely run. And what I've watched over the last decade or so in American naval circles and strategic circles is as we see China building up its naval fleet, although it is ostensibly designed primarily for the defense of globalization, defense of its own trade, its own dependence on sea-based trade. What if it's not? What if it has wider strategic purposes? And what that has kicked off, I can go into much more detail as we want. What it's kicked off is an arms race, a naval arms race. I spent some time in the boat on this ship. It's the USS John Paul Jones. It's the most sophisticated Aegis missile destroyer in the American fleet. I try to highlight in the book that contemporary naval competition is not about ship-to-ship combat. It's primarily about the use of radar and sensors to guide long-range missile strike, both to take out each other's fleets, but also potentially for strikes on American bases or American strikes on Chinese infrastructure. China has not only built up what is now the world's largest surface naval fleet, it's hugely expanded its submarine fleet, and it's built out, this is a surface fleet, but it's also built out land installations in the East and the South China Sea from which it can deploy aircraft and rocketry to weaken our capacity to patrol in those waters. And the most important thing in my mind is it's developed easily the world's most sophisticated missile force, more sophisticated than ours by a good measure. These are DF-26s, these are Chinese missiles that they're mobile and able to take out an aircraft carrier at a distance of around 2,500 miles. This has fundamentally changed the balance of power in Asia. For the United States, the remaining key strategic advantage is its nuclear submarines. And one of the reasons why we've seen this huge renewed investment in the submarine fleet, the largest ever defense procurement order for an expansion of the submarine fleet recently. And the announcement 2 days after I published my book, the decision to launch what was called the AUKUS deal, the Australia, UK, US deal on nuclear submarines, has all to do with the fact that the nuclear submarine fleet remains the most important strategic advantage that we have over the Chinese fleet. It all amounts to an arms race, a naval arms race taking place in the Western Pacific, precisely in those waterways that constitute the most important trade passageways in the world. 50 or somewhere between 50 and 55% of all world trade flows through those waterways. We're watching in LA Long Beach the consequences of interruptions in the global supply chain. I try to talk to people about what happens to the supply chain if we end up fighting a naval war with the Chinese in the Pacific, in the Taiwan Strait, or in the wider reaches of the Western Pacific. That is not a distant prospect. I spent this morning commenting on war plans produced by somebody on the Defense Policy Board for blockading Chinese ports in the event of a military incursion in Taiwan. And so what I try to dramatize in the book is just this profound disjuncture right now between, on the one hand, a world of closely interlinked economic globalization, and on the other, a world of mounting strategic distrust and an arms race that follows. And I worry that now is the world in which we're in. I highlight in the book the huge economic consequence to the United States of maritime trade, of sea-based trade in every part of industry, whether you're in the software industry and you're worried about data. 93% of all data in the world flows on undersea cables. Whether you're worried about financing of trade, as I said, even 5% of world trade flows by sea. Just huge consequence for the United States. And at the same time, the development of this very acute naval arms race in the Western Pacific. I could go on at length into energy issues, which I cover in the book, and climate change and ocean sciences and others, but I won't. Let me leave it there, Stas, and we can sort of pick up the conversation in whichever direction is of interest to the group.
Bruce, thank you very, very much. This is not a very optimistic view of the future, and it comes at a time when we are challenged by supply chain issues and challenged by our internal disputes over investment and a lack of support for the very things that the Chinese have emphasized, which we talked about in terms of ports, first of all, Yangshan and its huge lead as a port compared to ports in the United States that are underinvested and were just last week the subject of a International Propeller Club presentation by John Porcari, the Biden administration port envoy. The military side to this reflects, in many cases, the lack of investment that we have made on the commercial side. And in your book, you talk a lot about how globalization and the development of containers and containerization facilitated trade and has facilitated the ability to outsource products and components to different parts of the world. I would like to open up the floor for questions. If anybody would like to ask Bruce any question, please either raise your hand or use the raise your hand function. Bruce, one of the changes that has occurred while your book was being written is that OOCL, which was a Hong Kong company, is now part of the Chinese maritime umbrella along with COSCO. And I was wondering if you could maybe give us a few observations about what is the collaborative size of the Chinese maritime fleet and how does OOCL help complement that development along with COSCO?
Yeah, it had actually taken place just as I was concluding. So I spent a bunch of time with CH Tung in various cities around the world, but mostly in Hong Kong. And it was really interesting over the course of that time because, you know, at the same time, China was doing its kind of clamp down on Hong Kong. In the first times that I was meeting with him, I was at his OOCL offices, and the later times I was in his office that he's given as the former governor of Hong Kong. It was just a kind of interesting symbolic change. What he said to me, I talk about this in the book, is that he and his brothers, I think they were number 7 in the world, and they were looking at the question of what to do. And he had emphasized early on in the development of OOCL the application of technology to shipping. And then, as in these are his words, he was looking at the way Maersk had invested in technology and recognizing that he wasn't going to be able to keep up, and they were either going to have to kind of do a major financing drive to kind of move up the technology chain, or they were going to sell, and that's the point at which he sells to COSCO. It was interesting, by the way, I was on the Maersk, the Madrid Maersk, as I said at the time, was the world's largest trading vessel, 20,526 TEU. And on the bridge, all the sailors were gossiping about this rumor that somebody was going to be building a 24,000 TEU ship, and they were kind of dismissing it. Oh, it can't be done, can't be done. And of course, it wasn't COSCO. I think it was CMA. I'm sorry, not CMA. It was I can't remember. It was a Chinese shipping firm that launched in partnership with the Italians, launched a 23,900 TEU ship several months later. So it just really does illustrate the scale that China has taken over, obviously also in port acquisition around the world. And this also gets American sort of naval hackles arising, because one of the things I talk about in the book is the shift in Djibouti, where China has, of course, an important port, but also then opened a naval base immediately adjacent to it. And Djibouti, I mean, you all understand perfectly well the importance. This is at the entrance from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. And the strategic community, you have to remind people where the hell Djibouti is. I try to point out to people that every empire that has held sway in world affairs has at one point or another held a naval position in the Bab el-Mandab, the Gate of Tears, at sort of the entrance between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, where the Chinese port is just 80 miles from that. So it's a kind of a little bit of a pre-signal about what's happening. We saw a couple of weeks ago China doing a deal to develop a naval base adjacent to one of its ports in Equatorial Guinea. So you are seeing this kind of putting in place of this ports infrastructure as well as the commercial infrastructure. What I argue in the book is that what China is doing is following a model that the West pioneered, right? This is how the British built the world of the British Empire. It was commercial in its first interest, and the Navy came afterwards. We've had a close interplay between trade and the Navy during the period of American dominance of world affairs. China is now vastly the world's largest trading country with these huge shipping stakes. Unsurprising that they should want to develop a naval capacity to protect it. The question is, can we coexist in the management of those two projects, or are we bound to a more conflictual relationship between the US Navy and the Chinese Navy and the two communities as a whole? And unfortunately, as you say in the book, I end on a somewhat pessimistic note. I don't rule out cooperation for the protection of trade and protection of globalization, but it's not the dynamic that I'm watching. The dynamic that I'm watching is a rapid deterioration of trust and of geopolitical relations, with this naval arms race really being at the center of that dynamic.
Very good, thank you. Other questions? Susan, you had a question about the availability. Susan Ransom?
Yes, hi, sorry about that. Yeah, I was asking if this book was available on audio. I'm not a big hardback person. I like to wear my earbuds. So yeah, I was wondering if it was available on audio somewhere.
Yeah, it's on Audible. You can get
good.
the audiobook on audio. I'll be curious. Bill Nixon said he has been listening to it. I listened to it as well. It's a sort of strange out-of-body experience to listen to somebody else read my own words. I don't know, Bill, now you've heard me, which narrator you prefer, me or the professional, but yes, it's available there.
Right, I have Audible, so that's perfect.
There's also been a number of podcasts. I can shoot a link to Stas after this if you want to share, so just to get a podcast version of it as well.
Right, great, thank you.
I will do that, Bruce. If you can do that, I will distribute that.
Great.
Bill Nixon, your hand is up.
Well, just as a comment, there's a number of books that to me seem to be pillars of the industry that everyone in this room is concerned with, and I particularly appreciate as illustrative. The one is the box, about the development of the container, 99%, 90% of everything. And right now, Bobby Winston just had me read The World for Sale about the trading companies, which is more on oil and coal and stuff like that. And I just listened to the first, well, I can't say pages right now because it's Audible, but it's just the first 15 minutes. And I'm thinking this book is going to be right up there, in my opinion, with the box and 99%, which, it would take everybody to read all or listen to all of these books to really, the politicians that are trying to fix our world, to really fully comprehend the magnitude of what pretty much everybody in this room already knows about, but we're not the politicians that are trying to fix everything. So anyhow, congratulations. It's a great book. It's to my thinking, from my little tiny foxhole, I'm not a container guy. I'm a dirt oil guy, but I think your predictions are right on target with the way the world's moving, actually.
I very much appreciate that. And, I had this very nice surprise because on the day the book was being released, the Wall Street Journal did a review, and it was a very positive review. And I was reading through it, feeling very happy, and wondering who wrote it, and got to the end, and it was Mark Levinson who wrote the box, who did the review of the book. So that was a nice little, a nice piece.
Very good. John Hark, you have a question.
Yeah, I'm just curious, Bruce, when the Chinese are expanding around the world with port development, and mining, let's say, investment in South America and in Africa, for instance. And I also saw there was a story on, I think, 60 Minutes Australia some time ago about some of the South Pacific governments where the Australians have sort of lost ground in their helping of those countries with financing and export financing, I guess. When the Chinese are going in, if it is companies, which, you know, we hear obviously that most of the companies have some connection to the government apparatus, let's say, do we know if in these deals that are cut to do port development and financing, is there an agreement there that allows the Chinese to also put a naval base in or put some type of a naval presence? Or does that come afterwards when some of these countries start to have issues with paying back? Let's say, you know, we hear stories where some of these countries unfortunately have trouble paying back some of the financing. I'm just curious if it's part of the deals up front, if we know that, or if it comes later as sort of when they're on the ropes.
Yeah, the answer is later. They don't do it up front. It's not part of the original contract or deal or anything like that. They do the financing, do the infrastructure, the port development, and they buy out large quantities of debt and they lend money, right? And so, for example, in Djibouti, it's actually the Djiboutian ambassador to Washington came to see me, this is several years ago, and he said they were trying to sell their port, okay? Now they had this huge debt. They had to sell off some state assets to deal with the IMF conditionality. They wanted to sell the port. Dubai Ports World wanted to buy it out of Abu Dhabi or out of Dubai, wanted to buy it. And the Chinese came to them and said, if you sell it to Dubai Ports World, we will strangle your debt. Okay. And he came to see me and he said, look, I'm trying to get somebody in the State Department to pay attention to this because, you know, we can't do anything about this. I mean, we can't deal with the Chinese debt situation. We're going to have to sell it to them instead. And I can't get everybody in the State Department to pay attention, right? And again, I've sort of mentioned that, you know, if you're in the American strategic world in that point in time, Djibouti, I don't know, some African country, something I may have heard of, right? Just zero sense of the significance in terms of its kind of maritime position. And so, of course, we didn't help the Djiboutians with their debt. We didn't sort of help, you know, solve the situation with the IMF, whatever. And they sold the port to the Chinese. And then a year later, lo and behold, the Chinese have a logistics station immediately next door, right? And same thing just now with Equatorial Guinea, same arrangement. And there are, you know, depending on who's counting, something in the order of 30 ports that are in a similar situation. And so what I write about in the book, you know, it's not the case that they have developed yet a global network of bases, but they certainly have a global network of ports that could, under the right circumstances, rapidly be turned into dual use mechanisms. And that's where we are. That's where we are right now.
When was Djibouti? When did this happen?
2019, maybe.
Okay. And they attempted to reach out to the State Department at that time to warn them about what was going on and got no reaction.
Because they didn't want to sell to the Chinese. They wanted to sell to Dubai Ports World. They were worried about what would happen to them if there ended up being a Chinese base on Djibouti shore. There's already an American base there. Nobody at the State Department was paying the slightest attention. And by the way, just one little, you make the point about sort of, are these state-owned or are they private enterprises? So the port is private enterprise, but every American serviceman and woman flying into Djibouti or going into Djibouti to join Africa Command, which is a hugely important part of our counterterrorism operation, goes through a Chinese-owned port, which is entirely monitored by Chinese facial recognition and AI technology. Every single serviceman and woman that goes through that is now in the Chinese facial recognition capture technology, right? This is the kind of thing we're just not getting. We're not sort of on top of it. Somebody says, oh, port in Djibouti, I don't know, is a trade issue for Africa. No, these are key strategic moves being made by the Chinese, and we're absolutely asleep at the switch on this stuff, or at least have been. We're a little bit more awake now.
Scott Conrad, you came in late, and I know that you have had some concerns and discussed with me the situation in Sri Lanka. Scott, do you want to just share the issues that you discussed in Sri Lanka?
Sure. Just to give a little bit of background, my wife is originally from Trincomalee, the largest harbor there in Sri Lanka. And so we visited there a few times over the last couple, 20 years and such to family. Anyway, since the Civil War ended, the Chinese have pretty much taken over the port and management, also most major industries in that area. So they pretty much control that port, which is, as most of you know, Sri Lanka being very strategic during World War II and other naval conflicts over the centuries. And it's just an example of them asserting more world potential dominance, both from a military and commercial point of view, potentially.
Absolutely. If you think about the geography here, if you're coming out of the east coast of China, you have to get past the Malacca Strait. So that's your first major obstacle, right? We have naval dominance of the southern end of the South China Sea. You have to get past that and through the Strait of Malacca. Once you do that, you're sailing out into the Indian Ocean. But you're a long way away from China by then, right? By historical standards. Now, we have the capacity to support a Navy at any point in the world. We have the logistics and the satellites and the communications to do that. But that stuff is hard. And we have bases all over the world that can do refuel and resupply and support for our global naval presence. China doesn't have nearly as much of that. And so as you're coming out of the Malacca Strait and heading into the Indian Ocean, I describe in the book India as a kind of 1,000-mile dagger in the heart of Chinese ambitions. But boy, does it help a lot if you could have a Chinese base on Sri Lanka, right? And then you have a kind of refueling capability and a restoration capability sort of launching into the Indian Ocean, and on the other side of that, you've got Djibouti. And so with the Maldives and other places, they're in a kind of pitched battle. I mean, diplomatic and economic and political battle to gain loyalty of those countries in order to get that sort of posture in the Indian Ocean that they so far lack.
This is Jahan. I was in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago and saw firsthand what Scott mentioned, not just the ports that the Chinese paid for, but airports and other infrastructure.
Right.
And I'm not sure how accurate this is, but when I worked for another shipping line and we were looking at this, Colombo is really a point of indifference where you can go, if you're taking cargo, as a transshipment point, you can go through the Suez or through the Pacific, and it's about the same amount of transit time. And that's why Sri Lanka is a big textile and apparel exporter. But they love that pivot. The Chinese love that pivot that's in Colombo for, as you said, the minerals and supplies out of East Africa and then coming through. So it's a really strategic point that I think the US is not really focused on.
Yeah, and a major unknown is whether not whether, at what rate India develop its naval capability in that part of the world, right? Because you think about this in historical terms, and you go back to that early period that I was talking about, and the major economies in the world are the Europeans, the Indians, and the Chinese. We're not on the scene yet. We come into the scene later. The Chinese and the Indians economy collapse. We've seen the huge return of the Chinese economy. We've seen a partial return of the Indian economy. We have not seen the full return of the Indian economy. And we have not seen as yet India really turn to maritime capability, to have a fairly small navy, and they play a big role, as you all no doubt know, in terms of providing seamen to the maritime industry. But they don't have a particularly robust maritime capability themselves. I point out in the book, this is the 5th largest economy in the world. They have exactly 1 port in the top 50 in the world. But they are now pouring resources into their naval infrastructure in the Bay of Bengal. Because again, if you think about the Chinese ships coming out of the Strait of Malacca, the first thing you're going to hit is the Bay of Bengal. And the Indians building up this series of ports, Port Blair and others there, to sort of be the first point of contact that the Chinese fleet would hit, and getting a lot of encouragement from the United States. Again, the same week that I published the book, we had the first ever meeting at the leaders level of the Quad, which is this quadrilateral mechanism that links the United States, Australia, Japan, and India. And that's very deliberate in an effort to try to boost Indian interest in their naval infrastructure and their port infrastructure, to be a bulwark against China in those waters, by us having to do it ourselves.
So we are at 1 minute before the hour. Is there one last question before we go? Because Bruce has got to take off in a couple of minutes. Anybody else has got a question? On that note, Bruce, I want to thank you very much for this. I think that this, again, is a question. One of the questions that we will all have to ask ourselves is, did this rise happen at a time that we were involved in a major lack of investment? And that was our attention turned by cutting back on resources, investments, infrastructure, transportation, and trade, and not having a viable merchant marine, which is an issue that our president, international president, Jim Patty, referred to in a speech that he gave to the Propeller Club of Northern California when we had our Sea Level Defense Conference. You've given us a lot of thoughtful issues to think about. One of the issues that is going to be a challenge is, how do we turn our fortunes around, and whether it's even possible with the huge lead that China has, and how are we going to develop a maritime strategy for the United States to start rebuilding and reasserting our maritime role. Based on what you've said, we can no longer ignore that situation, but it requires a huge investment in shipbuilding, in containers and chassis, in international trade, in port development and cargo handling, and not the least of which is electronics, and as you pointed out, AI. So on that note, I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Our next presentation is going to be with Lars Jensen from Vespucci Maritime, who has been a frequent speaker, and that will be February 8th. If anybody has any questions of Bruce, please send them to me and I will forward them. Bruce, if you have any, I've got the one link that you sent. I'll distribute that. If there's anything else that you want us to have, I will get that out. I believe that we need to start making some tracks to start looking at a maritime strategy for the United States, Bruce. And I think that you have given us some thought-provoking concerns that we need to start referencing. And I hope to follow up with you at a later date on that. Thank you all very much. I'm sure we're very grateful to Bruce. And this, I hope, is not the beginning of the end, but the end of us looking the other way.
Very much appreciate it. And thanks for having me on, Seth. Thank you all for participating.
Okay. And again, everybody, thank you for all of your good works. I will see you February 8th. We are recording this. I will have the recording, or Todd will have the recording out next tomorrow. And be well. See you on February 8th. And thank you all on the maritime front for all of your good work.